In the winter of 1953, a woman named Nora Veldon walked into Coldwater Asylum in rural West Virginia, carrying a single suitcase and a letter from a county judge she had never met. She was 31 years old. She had a husband, two daughters aged 7 and 9, a house with a garden she tended every summer, and a life that, by every account anyone who knew her has ever given, was an ordinary, quiet, decent one. She walked through those front doors on a Tuesday morning in February, and she never walked back out again. What happened to Nora Veldon inside Coldwater Asylum? And what happened to the family she left behind? And what happened to the building itself, and the hundreds of other lives it consumed across 6 decades of operation, is a story that this corner of West Virginia has been sitting with, mostly in silence, for longer than most of the people living here today have been alive. This is that story. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who stops when you hear about a forgotten place and a forgotten person and thinks somebody ought to know about this, stick around, because Nora Veldon is not the only name in this story that deserves to be remembered. And if your own family has a connection to a place like Coldwater, and in West Virginia, more families do than you might expect, I'd be glad to hear about it in the comments. Our story begins not with Nora and not with Coldwater, but with the town that built it. Harlan's Fork was, in 1897, a coal town in the truest sense. Every man in it worked the same seam. Every family lived in a company house. Every child went to the same company school. And the rhythms of daily life were set not by any local government or community institution, but by the whistle of the mine that employed virtually everyone. By the standards of that era and that region, Harlan's Fork was not an unusually hard place to live. It was simply a coal town, with everything that meant the danger, the dust, the particular closeness of a community that understood itself to be held together by a single fragile thread. The knowledge that the mine could take a husband, or a father, or a son on any given shift, and that the town would grieve together and then go back to work, because there was nothing else to do. It was in this context that a group of local civic leaders and church elders, convened in 1897 by a Presbyterian minister named Reverend Amos Holt, proposed the construction of what they called, in the founding document that survives in the West Virginia State Archive, a refuge and place of healing for those among us whose minds have been broken by the hardships of this life. The language is worth pausing on, because it tells you something about how the institution was conceived, not as a warehouse, not as a place of punishment, but as a response to what these men, looking around at their community, actually saw. Miners who had come up from cave-ins, changed in ways their families couldn't reach. Widows who had lost children and husbands in the same year and simply stopped functioning. Young men whose behavior had become, in the community's judgment, incomprehensible and frightening. These were the people Reverend Holt had in mind when he proposed Coldwater, and his founding vision, whatever the institution eventually became, began from a place of genuine, if paternalistic, concern. Coldwater Asylum opened in 1899 on a parcel of land 3 miles outside Harlan's Fork, in a 2-story brick building that the community had largely funded through church collections and civic donations, a fact that, in the early years, gave the institution a particular character, a sense of local ownership and local accountability that distinguished it, for its first decade at least, from the larger, more impersonal, state-funded asylums that were being built across the region during this same period. Reverend Holt served on its board until his death in 1921. Local families knew families who had relatives inside. The institution's first superintendent, a physician named Dr. Samuel Carr, made a point of attending the same church most of his patients' families attended, a practice that, by surviving accounts, produced a kind of informal, ongoing community dialogue about the institution's operation that later superintendents would not maintain. By every account from this early period, Coldwater functioned in something like the way it was intended to. The population was small, never more than 40 or 50 patients in its first decade. The staff was adequate for that number, and the institution's surviving records from the Carr era reflect a physician who was genuinely trying to treat and, where possible, return patients to their families. Discharge records from the first 10 years show a meaningful number of patients released back into the community. Not all, not most, but enough to suggest an institution that had not yet entirely abandoned the idea that recovery was possible. The change came in 1911, the year Dr. Carr retired and was replaced by a man named Dr. Frederick Haynes, who arrived at Coldwater from a larger institution in Ohio and who brought with him a set of administrative priorities that were, in their own way, as characteristic of the era as Reverend Holt's founding idealism had been. Where Carr had run Coldwater as a small, community-rooted facility, Haynes saw an opportunity. The state of West Virginia, in 1911, was in the middle of the same push toward large-scale institutional expansion that was happening across the country, and Haynes understood that larger institutions received larger state appropriations. Within 3 years of his arrival, Coldwater's population had doubled. Within 10, it had tripled. By 1930, a building designed for 50 patients held over 300. The families of Harlan's Fork noticed. Several surviving letters from the 1920s, written by family members of patients to the institution's board, describe visits in which their relatives were housed in conditions that bore no resemblance to what Carr's Coldwater had looked like. Overcrowded wards, unfamiliar staff who didn't know patients by name, a front entrance that, by multiple accounts, felt less like the door to a community refuge and more like the door to something you were not meant to enter casually or leave quickly. One letter, written in 1924 by a man named Clarence Webb, whose wife had been a patient at Coldwater since 1919, describes arriving for a scheduled visit and being told, for the third consecutive time, that his wife was not available for visiting at this time, without any further explanation. Webb's letter asks, with a restraint that reads now as barely contained desperation, whether any person outside these walls has the right to know the condition of a person inside them, or whether that right belongs only to the institution itself. No response to Clarence Webb's letter survives in the archive. What does survive, though, is a second letter from Clarence Webb, written 8 months later, in early 1925, that was not addressed to the institution's board, but to the West Virginia State Board of Health directly. This letter is longer, more detailed, and considerably less restrained than the first. Webb describes, in specific terms, what he had observed during the visits he had been permitted. His wife housed in a ward with far more patients than beds, receiving no individualized medical attention that he could observe, and presenting, by his account, as significantly more deteriorated in her condition than she had been when she arrived in 1919, a deterioration he attributed not to the progression of any underlying illness, but to the conditions of her confinement. He names specific staff members he had dealt with. He describes specific interactions he had found troubling, and he closes the letter with a sentence that, reading it now almost exactly a century later, is difficult to sit with. I am writing to you because I have run out of other people to write to, and because my wife is still inside that building, and because someone in authority ought to know that there are families out here who are paying attention, even if the institution has decided we are not worth answering. The State Board of Health's response to Clarence Webb's letter, filed 3 months later, acknowledged receipt of his concerns and noted that an inspection of Coldwater had been scheduled. An inspection was indeed conducted in 1925, and its report, while noting several areas for improvement in the institution's physical plant, concluded overall that conditions at Coldwater were within acceptable parameters for an institution of this type and size. Webb wrote one more letter after receiving a copy of the inspection report that consists of a single paragraph. He thanks the board for conducting the inspection. He notes that his wife died at Coldwater 6 weeks before the inspection was completed. He says he hopes the inspection's findings are of use to the families of the patients who remain. He does not write again. Clara Webb's death is recorded in Coldwater's partial surviving mortality log as occurring in January of 1925, cause listed as cardiac failure secondary to prolonged illness. She was 44 years old. She had been at Coldwater for 6 years. No death certificate filed under her name has been located in the West Virginia Vital Records Office for this period, a gap that researchers have noted is consistent with a broader pattern of incomplete death reporting from smaller institutions like Coldwater during this era, and that means Clara Webb does not appear in any official state record to have died at all. It was into this institution, larger than its founders had imagined, less accountable than its first superintendent had made it, and increasingly disconnected from the community that had built it, that Nora Veldin walked on a Tuesday morning in February of 1953. Nora's commitment, reconstructed from the partial records that survive and from accounts given by her family in the decades since, followed a pattern that, by 1953, had become almost routine at institutions like Coldwater, a pattern that tells you less about Nora specifically than about how the system worked for women of her generation and her circumstances. Her husband, a man named Gerald Veldin who worked for the county road department, had petitioned a county judge for her commitment, following what the petition describes as a period of erratic and unmanageable behavior, lasting approximately 6 weeks. The petition does not specify what erratic and unmanageable meant in practice. The surviving medical evaluation attached to the commitment order, a single page, signed by a physician whose name appears nowhere else in the local medical records of the period, describes Nora as exhibiting hysteria and nervous instability incompatible with the proper management of a household. What was actually happening to Nora Veldin in the 6 weeks before her commitment is known, now, from her older daughter Ruth, who was 9 years old at the time and who gave an extended interview to a West Virginia journalist in 2001, 50 years after the fact. That is the most complete surviving account of what Nora's family experienced during this period. Ruth described a mother who was, by her 9-year-old recollection, genuinely struggling, crying frequently, sleeping irregularly, unable to manage some of the household tasks she normally handled, but who was, by every other measure Ruth could apply to the memory, still clearly herself, still engaged with her daughters, still cooking their meals and asking about their school days and tucking them in at night. Ruth said that the behavior her father had characterized to the judge as erratic and unmanageable was, to her child's eye, a mother who was having a very hard time, but who was still, unmistakably, her mother. What Ruth also described, and what she said she had spent 50 years deciding whether to say publicly, was her understanding of why her father had petitioned for the commitment when he did. Gerald Veldin, by Ruth's account, had been involved with another woman for approximately a year before Nora's commitment. Ruth said she had not known this at 9 years old, but had pieced it together over the following years, from overheard conversations, from things neighbors said, and eventually from a direct conversation with her mother's sister, who had known and had spent the rest of her life unable to prove what she believed had happened. Gerald Veldon married the other woman 14 months after Nora's commitment. He never petitioned for Nora's release. Nora Veldon spent the next 22 years at Coldwater Asylum. She died there in 1975, at the age of 53, of what her death certificate lists as cardiac arrest. She had not seen her daughters since 1953. Ruth, by her own account, had tried to visit twice in her teenage years and had been turned away both times, told that her mother was not well enough for visitors. By the time Ruth was an adult and legally able to petition for access independent of her father's wishes, she had been told, by staff at the institution, that her mother did not want contact with her family. Ruth said, in the 2001 interview, that she had never been certain whether that was true, and that the uncertainty had been, in some ways, harder to carry than a definitive answer in either direction would have been. There is one more piece of the Nora Veldon story that Ruth disclosed in that interview, a piece she described as the one she had most debated including, and that I think is the right note to carry into the rest of this account. In 1987, 12 years after Nora's death, Ruth requested her mother's full patient file from the West Virginia State Archive. Among the documents in that file was a letter, undated, written in handwriting Ruth recognized immediately as her mother's. The letter was addressed to Ruth and to her younger sister Patricia. It said, in its entirety, "I want you to know that I think about you every day, and that none of this was your fault, and that I love you both more than I have words for. I do not know if this letter will reach you. I am sending it because not sending it is worse than sending it and not knowing. Your mother." There is no record in the file of the letter having been sent. There is no record of it having been intercepted or withheld. It is simply there, in the file, unsent. A letter a woman wrote to her daughters from inside an asylum in West Virginia, sometime in the years before her death, that stayed in a filing cabinet for over a decade after she died, until her daughter found it, while requesting records she'd hoped would tell her something about what her mother's life had looked like on the inside. Nora Veldon's story is the one that, because of Ruth's willingness to tell it publicly, has become the most fully documented individual case connected to Coldwater's history. But she was not, of course, the only person inside that building whose story deserved to be told. Among the partial patient records that survive in the State Archive, one name that researchers have repeatedly returned to is that of a man named James Earl Sutton, a coal miner from a town about 30 miles from Harlan's Fork, who was committed to Coldwater in 1931, at the age of 27, following what his commitment record describes as a complete mental breakdown subsequent to industrial accident. Language that, read against the broader context of what was happening in the West Virginia coalfields in 1931, almost certainly describes something like what we would today call severe post-traumatic stress following a mining disaster. James Earl Sutton's commitment record is sparse, as most records from this era are, but it does include one detail that is unusual for its specificity: a notation, made at intake, that Sutton had a wife named Dorothy and 3 children, ages 2, 4, and 6, and that his commitment had been arranged with the understanding, expressed by the committing physician, that it was temporary in nature, pending recovery. The word temporary appears, underlined, in the intake form. It is the only underlined word in the document. James Earl Sutton remained at Coldwater for 19 years. He was discharged in 1950, at the age of 46, to a son who had been 2 years old when he was admitted and was now 21. His wife Dorothy had, according to the discharge documentation, died in 1944. His other 2 children's whereabouts at the time of his discharge are not noted in the surviving record. The discharge summary describes Sutton as stable and capable of supervised community living, a clinical assessment that, if accurate, raises its own quiet question about what the preceding 19 years had been for, and that, if anything less than fully accurate, raises a different and darker set of questions entirely. A grandson of James Earl Sutton, a man named David Sutton, who still lives in the county, was contacted by a researcher in 2009 and agreed to speak briefly about what he knew of his grandfather's story. He said his grandfather had never spoken about Coldwater after his discharge, not to his son, not to anyone in the family as far as David knew, and that the family had essentially treated those 19 years as a gap that existed in their history but was not discussed. He said his grandfather had died in 1967, 17 years after his release, and that what David knew about Coldwater came entirely from the researcher's inquiry and the records the researcher had found, rather than from anything that had been passed down within the family. He came back, David Sutton said, and whatever he'd seen in there, he kept it. We never knew what it cost him to keep it. Ruth Veldon, who took back her mother's maiden name as an adult and goes by Ruth Marsh today, still lives in West Virginia. She is in her 80s. She spent a significant part of her adult life advocating for the rights of people held in state institutions, work she has described as the direct result of what happened to her mother. She has never publicly forgiven her father, though she has said, carefully, that forgiveness is between him and whatever he believes in, and that what she is interested in is not forgiveness but accountability, which, in the case of Gerald Veldon, who died in 1991, is no longer possible in any formal sense, and which, in the case of the system that made what he did possible, is a conversation West Virginia and states like it are still, haltingly, trying to have. Coldwater Asylum closed in 1961, 8 years before Nora Veldon died, when its patient population was consolidated into a larger regional facility as part of the same statewide institutional reorganization that closed dozens of smaller asylums across the state during this period. The building itself was not demolished. It passed through several owners, sat empty for most of the following decades, and stands today, 3 miles outside what's left of Harlan's Fork, which is itself a much smaller place than it was in 1899, the mine having closed in the 1970s, and most of the families having followed the work elsewhere, in the same state of slow, patient collapse that abandoned brick buildings in this part of West Virginia tend toward. I wanted to see it for myself, so I made the drive out to Harlan's Fork on a gray morning this past spring, following directions from a local historical society that had been kind enough to send me a map. We're out here now, on the road that runs past the old Coldwater property, and I want to tell you, this is a quieter piece of country than I expected, even for this part of West Virginia. The town itself, what's left of it, is maybe half a mile back down the road. A few houses, a post office, a church that's still active. And then, out here, set back from the road behind a rusted gate, and a fence that's been falling down for longer than I've been alive, is the building. It's smaller than the institutions we've covered before on this channel, which makes sense, given Coldwater's history. It never got as large as the state-run asylums, never held thousands. But standing here looking at it, the size of it doesn't really register the way it would on a bigger building. What registers is something else. The windows on the second floor are mostly gone, and the brick around them has darkened from decades of weather, and there are trees growing up along the east wall that are clearly old enough to have been saplings when the last patient was still inside. Before I drove out here, I stopped by the Historical Society in the nearest town, a single room in the back of the public library staffed by a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, who has been collecting local history for the better part of 30 years. She had a folder on Coldwater, which she pulled out without my even having to ask specifically. Said she keeps it close to hand because people come in looking for it fairly regularly, more than you'd think, for a building that closed over 60 years ago. Inside the folder were photocopies of some of the documents we've discussed today, portions of the Clarence Webb correspondence, excerpts from the 1925 inspection report, and a brief newspaper article from 1961 announcing the institution's closure that was, Margaret noted, the only coverage Coldwater ever received in the local paper during its entire 62 years of operation. One article, in 1961, announcing it was closing. Nothing before that. No coverage of the overcrowding, no coverage of the families who couldn't get answers, no coverage of the deaths that were occurring at a rate that should have drawn attention. Margaret said she thought it reflected something true about how communities like this one related to institutions like Coldwater. It was the mine that mattered, she said. Everything else was peripheral, even this. A man who lives about a quarter-mile down the road came out to the fence when he saw me standing there and talked with me for a few minutes. He said he'd lived there his whole life, and that growing up, Coldwater was simply a fact of the landscape, something you passed on the road and didn't think about too carefully. He said his grandmother had known a woman whose sister was at Coldwater for a long time. He couldn't remember the name. He said his grandmother had always said the same thing when it came up, that the hardest part wasn't what happened inside, hard as that was. The hardest part was that nobody on the outside ever really knew what was happening in there, and most of them hadn't tried very hard to find out. He stood at the fence for a moment, looking up at the building, and then he said something that I keep coming back to. My grandmother said the saddest thing wasn't the people who went in. It was the people who stayed out here waiting for them to come back, and eventually stopped waiting, and eventually stopped talking about it, and eventually just moved on. Like the building wanted everyone to forget, and eventually everyone did. That sentence has stayed with me since that morning on the road outside Harlan's Fork. Like the building wanted everyone to forget. Because in a way, that's exactly what happened. Not through any single deliberate act, but through the accumulated weight of 62 years of a community, deciding again and again that what was happening 3 miles down the road was someone else's concern. The county judge who signed Nora Veldon's commitment order and never reviewed it again. The state board that received Clarence Webb's letter and filed an inspection report that concluded everything was within acceptable parameters while Clara Webb was dying inside the building. The local newspaper that covered the mine, the church, the school, the weather, and never once in 62 years sent a reporter up that road to see what was happening there. I'll leave you with Nora Veldon's letter, because I think it says, more plainly than anything else in this story, what all those records and reports and administrative decisions can't quite reach. A woman sat down, at some point in the years before her death, in a building 3 miles outside a coal town in West Virginia, and wrote to her daughters that she thought about them every day, and that none of it was their fault, and that she loved them more than she had words for. And then the letter stayed in a filing cabinet. It stayed there after she died. It stayed there for 12 more years, until her daughter found it in 1987, 43 years old, her mother dead more than a decade. Reading handwriting, she recognized across a distance she had spent her whole adult life trying to close. What Ruth said when the journalist asked what it felt like was this. It felt like her mother had been trying to reach her the whole time, and the building had just been in the way. Coldwater Asylum has been empty for more than 60 years. The building is still on that hillside. James Earl Sutton's 19 years are in a file in the state archive that his own family didn't know existed until a stranger went looking. And Nora Veldon's letter is in a box in Ruth Marsh's house in West Virginia, where Ruth, in her 80s now, has kept it since 1987, because she said once, in an interview, that keeping it is the only thing she can still do for her mother. The only thing left. Thanks so much for watching. If this story moved you the way it moved me, stick around. There are more forgotten stories like this one waiting to be told, and I'd be glad to have you along for the next one.